one of the leading researchers in aging and lifespan research with over 600 publications to his name.
With the exponential increase of mortality is, of course, the exponential increase of diseases. Humans are remarkably different from any other primate. Human evolution that allows a huge expansion of populations in the last 5,000 years from under 100,000 to 8 billion, enabled by our extended post-reproductive lifespan.
Is that realistic for long-term life extension?
This represents environment in some fundamental way that we haven't understood.
There is no such thing as a gene by itself being good or being bad.
We're in a completely non-evolutionarily selected world right now.
Until we recognize that our bodies and our genes were sculpted by the survival of our ancestors in a wildly different environment, we won't have success either in research or in our personal goal of maximizing lifespan.
This multi-billion-dollar a year market of over-the-counter nutritional supplements is a complete hoax. Total hoax. It is a lie. And they know it. They're just selling pills. There is almost no cardiovascular disease and no advanced Alzheimer's in this population.
Fascinating.
The basic conclusion that heart disease is rare in indigenous people was noted 100 years ago, but now we actually have data. Brain atrophy is 20 or 30% slower than North America.
So excited to be joined by Dr. Caleb Finch from USC Leonard Davis School of Gerontology, one of the leading researchers in the fundamental sciences of aging and lifespan research with multiple books and over 600 publications to his name. Dr. Finch, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, I appreciate this chance to have a broader discussion. I'm at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, a private university. I've been there since 1972.
You've had a profound impact on research into aging, as well as research into some of the associated diseases of aging, things like Alzheimer's.
I founded USC's Alzheimer's Research Center in 1984. At that time, I was the only PhD director of a clinical program. I learned an awful lot in a short time and ran it for 20 years, and happy I turned it over to an outstanding person, Helena Chu, who's chairman of neurology at SC.
So tell us about the common sort of conception of aging and how that contrasts with the academic study of aging. What kinds of variables are we concerned with in the academic study of aging?
Well, the main point is that in the risk of mortality, the mortality rate goes up exponentially after the age of 40 in all human populations and essentially doubles every 8 years. And this means that at age 100, you have something close to 30% chance of dying in the next year. And with the exponential increase of mortality is, of course, the exponential increase of diseases, among which is Alzheimer's disease, which has a faster exponential slope. So it means that about half of centenarians have cognitive impairments that would be clinical grade early or later Alzheimer's. So you need to die soon enough before you're brain gives out.
uh, as organisms become more adapted to their environment, we see them becoming great at resource acquisition, at finding and impressing mates, at a host of other adaptations. Why do we not see selection for infinitely long lifespans?
Well, to begin with, risk of mortality is high enough that every human would die if you kept their lowest mortality rate, which is about 0.3% at the age of about 20 to 30. So in almost all mammals and certainly all primates, mortality goes up exponentially. That's been the case for by the uh, primate evolutionary history for 20 million years. So the biology of aging now recognizes that mortality rates do differ widely between different kinds of organisms, and that patterns of aging are hugely different. There are some marine invertebrates that seem to live for several hundred years, and some whales may live at least 150 or 200 years. But the oldest human uh, is about 122, and that's predicted precisely by the uh, exponential increase of mortality rates. So, how humans are remarkably different from any other primate in that we have a 15 to 20-year post reproductive period that is simply not found. And it is this unique human evolution that allows our multi generational societies to reproduce twice as fast or even more than any of the great apes. The great apes typically wean at 5 to 7 years, and the uh, kids at 5 to 7 years are now at that age able to forage next to their mother. But our birth interval is usually 24 to 30 months, which means that the mother is pregnant when the child still needs extensive care, which is provided by older uh, members of the community, including grandmothers, and resource sharing that is found in all human communities that enables uh, women, if they choose, to have babies uh, every 2.5 years, which is far faster than in any primate. And it is seen by our huge expansion of populations in the last 5,000 years from under 100,000 to now what, 8 billion. So that is enabled by our extended post reproductive lifespan.
And the mathematics for that is stunningly accurate in its prediction that the contribution of resources acquired by that post-reproductive population is what enables that more shortened birth period, the birth
Exactly
interval that
so.
allows humans to now, of course, so significantly outnumber the other primates on the planet that we're very potentially going to finish off the extinction of the rest of the primate lineage at this point. So we
That's a
certainly
risk.
have
I don't think I hope to think it won't happen.
hopefully so. Hopefully we can make strides in that direction. So we've done this. We haven't intentionally hacked our biology to live longer, but selection for this kind of shortened birth interval, the contribution of resources from the post-reproductive, the sort of the grandparent contribution has enabled this unique lifespan extension in humans, but we're hungry for more, right? We live already significantly longer. And this is something a lot of us don't appreciate. We already outlive the majority of mammals, and we significantly outlive the other primates, and we're hungry for more, right? Everybody
Yeah,
is sort of
everybody
at the
wants
edge
to
of their
live
seats to
as
live longer and
healthy and
longer.
as long as possible. So there's two huge things that go on with aging that won't be cured by taking uh, a taking a pill. Uh, First and most important is that mutations occur during aging in every cell, whether it's dividing or not. Neurons in the brain of somebody who's 85, and I'm 85, side by side, those neurons, when looked at the level of DNA, have different mutations and different DNA arrangements. And the risk of cancer, of course, goes up exponentially in many tissues with age for the simple reason that you can't replicate DNA without some level of error. So, and then another totally different anatomical domain is our bones and joints. The cartilage between our spinal vertebrae uh, is not renewed. It gets oxidized and shrinks, and every one of us will lose height. Uh, I've lost essentially 1 inch in height per decades since the age of 30.
So we have a combination. So aging is a unique combination of sort of the invisible mutations accumulated by somatic cell lineages and the mechanical wear and tear from biological tissues like our connective tissue in our skeleton and in our connective tissue of the cartilage. The mechanical understanding of correcting age associated breakdown would lead us to think that if we can make advances in perhaps stem cell injections or artificial joint replacements, that we can at least fight this mechanical wear and tear. Is that realistic for long term life extension? And besides the mechanical wear and tear, are there any sort of cutting edge aging research indications that we could ever fight the genetic or cellular components of aging?
Well, those are two quite different domains that you put together. So let me take the cartilage first. The the amount of cartilage and its replacement that we have is determined by gene patterns in the embryo, which determines which cells will be replaced in the postnatal and the adult. So to uh, recover the regeneration of cartilage is not feasible in any way that I can tell with the modern technology. However, it turns out that spinal surgeons have recently uh, learned how to replace uh, discs in people's badly injured spines. But let me just say that all of this is extremely expensive and seems very unlikely to be able to be accessible to the bulk of people who aren't in the top level elite medical systems and have a great deal of personal money. So my uh, expectation is that most people in the uh, below the top uh, education and economic strata, SES strata, will continue to have shorter lifespans. Right now, the difference between being poor and rich at the top or the bottom of the socioeconomic scale is a 15-year different in lifespan. And the people in the lowest age faster. They have earlier onset cardiovascular disease and Alzheimer's disease. So this represents environment in some fundamental way that we haven't understood.
Are there things that we as a society should be doing? You've researched extensively the effects, for example, of air pollutants and toxin exposure on aging and aging related diseases. Are there things as a society that we could be doing to sort of level the playing field of aging, at least insofar as environmental exposures drive early aging?
Yeah, well, there's two inhaled toxins that uh, one is from cigarette smoke, and the other is from fossil fuel generated air pollution or roadway air pollution. So, re- diminishing the use of fossil fuels is a broad objective, but as you can read in the current papers, there's heavy pushback by the petroleum industry that wants to continue to develop new sources of petroleum, but that has a huge global toxic effect. And the second has to do with cigarette smoking, which in many countries is now uh, um, much reduced to about 10 to 12%. But this still means that roughly one third of kids grow up in a home where the adults smoke. So they are exposed in the lower socioeconomic groups to maternal smoke, which influences the fetal development, and of course, smoke in the childhood environment. So those are much harder issues to deal with. There's no realistic way to make cigarettes illegal. Some people want to smoke, and some people have the genes that protect them against it. And that was shown by my colleague at USC, Eileen Crimmins. And there's a major opportunity to learn more about how genetics influences vulnerability to air pollution and cigarette smoke. We have some evidence that the Alzheimer risk gene ApoE4 increases vulnerability to air pollution. And that's in an article that will be published quite soon in the Journal of Gerontology. So
And
there's
this is the
environment
gene.
interaction here that we have just begun to look at.
This is the gene that has gained fame for its contribution to the kind of damage that we're very concerned with aging. But
Let me
you've
be specific. So ApoE4 was first recognized as a gene which increased levels of blood cholesterol and risk of heart attack. And then 30 years ago was identified as an Alzheimer risk factor.
and it's received a significant amount of coverage, all the way trickling all the way down into the media. This gene variant for its contribution to cardiovascular disease, to Alzheimer's disease. And you recently co-authored also a paper on the very sort of paradoxical nature of the contribution of these so-called deleterious gene variants that may actually be present in human populations with a pretty broad distribution for their reproductive benefit. Is that correct? And can you kind of
Yes.
explain that for our audience?
So the ApoE4 gene is the evolutionarily oldest gene. Uh, and then about the same time as humans, Sapiens, H. sapiens evolved, a new gene called ApoE3 emerged. Now, the benefits of ApoE4 are seen very clearly uh, in a highly infectious circumstance. I'm part of two projects with anthropologists, one of them in Ghana and one of them in Bolivia, looking at people who live under high levels of infectious water and lots of infectious disease as the main cause of mortality. And it turns out that in both of those populations, uh, children with ApoE4 have better survival uh, into infections, and the adults live a little longer if they have ApoE4 than ApoE3. So the last year, my colleagues, I'm a middle author on this paper, looked at in the Bolivian Simane, uh, we showed that in that highly infected environment, ApoE4 girls go through menarche earlier. They had more children. And so this continues to demonstrate its advantage in a highly infectious environment. Um, so the future of ApoE4 is not yet fully described, of course, but there may be times in which, in the high levels of viruses we are encountered in the COVID area, that ApoE4 is advantageous.
This
What's
really highlights
suggested?
something this really highlights something that is so incredibly important with genetics. There is no such thing as a gene by itself being good or being bad. There is no such thing as a gene without the environmental interaction. And it's the
Exactly.
gene in the environment of Western society with longer lifespans and high chronic disease burden where we see this very negative effect. And it may very well be a selected allele for its benefit for reproductive success in other populations. This kind of also shines a light on some of the naivety that I think we're seeing in the excitement that has been generated over the gene editing era that we're entering, because some of us would like to imagine a future where we can sort of gene edit our way to longevity. But in the case of the ApoE4 alleles, the ApoE4 and ApoE3 demonstrate that unless you know the full environmental context of all of the offspring of a particular lineage, you don't know if selection of a particular variant is actually on the net going to be good or bad.
Precisely. Well, I think of the limits of gene editing in relationship to the inevitability of mutations in DNA in all the cells in our body increasing with age. I don't see how to uh, edit the human genome to decrease that. How, on the same breath, I would like to point out that the long-lived, huge marine mammals seem to have a slower somatic mutation rate than primates. So evolution has shaped mutation rate according to the life history and development evolution for different lines of animals.
And the challenge from our beloved bowhead whales, the super, super longevity mammals that are getting a lot of genomic exploration right now, is that there is no single target that has been tweaked to allow that lower mutation rate. There's no single target that has allowed them to sort of escape the oxygen paradox. There's a host of variants that have been fixed in that population to allow them to live somewhere close to the order, an entire order of magnitude longer than their closest relatives. Do we have any kind of realistic hope of doing that many genetic changes to humans, or is that kind of
Uh,
completely outside
I
the scope
I
of?
think that this would, at a population level, be remotely unlikely because I can't imagine that there would be an RNA editing pill that people would take that would uh, correct mutation rates throughout their body. But who knows what the future will find?
Can you tell us a little bit more about the difference in how the human environment selected for high reproductive rates in challenging environments and why that has not translated well into keeping us healthy in the very resource rich environment of the modern world?
Well, our modern world with antibiotics and vaccinations and minimization of infectious disease is a completely different environment than our past evolution, of course, where food was less certain, but infections were absolutely part of uh, from beginning to end of life. Um, Infant mortality, maternal mortality was high in association with uh, infections until really the early 20th century, which had to do with hygiene, better drinking water, uh, and pure, better food. Uh, ab- about 50 years before, and then vaccinations, and all of this 50 years before antibiotics came in the 1940s. So we're in a completely non-evolutionarily selected world right now. We're carrying genes that in our populations that were the result of selection in an infectious world, such as sickle cell genes. There's more than 20 uh, different mutations that increase resistance to malaria that uh, in our modern era with malaria being almost contained are no longer relevant, but can do damage. So we're dealing with major different classes of genes that were selected in the evolutionary domain before the 20th century that will be with us. And those, of course, are issues in lifespan risk and mortality risk.
And this really bears repeating in this era where there are so many internet gurus ready to sell you on the next supplement that they tell you will make you live super long, or ready to sell you on the next treatment that will somehow fix you and get you running longer. Humans are adapted for an environment that is not like the modern environment. We're not a machine, and we're certainly not a machine built to run in the 21st century. And until we recognize that our bodies and our genes were sculpted by the survival of our ancestors in a wildly different environment, we won't have success either in research or in our personal goal of maximizing lifespan or health span. In your research on.
Let me just add, so this multi-billion-dollar a year market of over-the-counter nutritional supplements is a complete hoax, total hoax. There's If you have access to freshly prepared vegetables and low salt, low sugar uh, diet, then you don't need any supplements. And supplements may actually work adversely with the fast food diet. So there's a commercial hoax blatant lie in the markets that have existed for 100 years, saying that there is lifespan promotion from taking these different supplements. It is a lie. And they know it. They're just selling pills.
If you are hearing this and you're sinking hundreds of dollars a month into supplements that your physician did not put you on, but you found out through marketing that promised you a longer lifespan, you may have bought into this idea that you are doing something to correct some kind of imbalance. But going back to the way that our bodies were adapted to consume more of a varied diet, a more whole food diet, a less ultra processed and ultra sweetened and ultra salted diet is, generally speaking, going to actually provide you with the spread of nutrients and minerals and other
Yes,
things that our body
exactly
actually
put.
needs as coenzymes.
Exactly put. And the difficulty for lower SES households is that they are often working, both parents are working two jobs and don't have time to go to grocery stores to get fresh food or prepare it. So it's a really difficult issue to approach.
And society has some leveling of the playing field to step up to with regards to accessing whole foods and quality foods for everybody in every SES class. It's also a part of medicine that we tend to overemphasize in the United States, where any kind of a pill is generally seen as a remedy to any kind of a malady. And when it comes to longevity and a lifetime of good eating, we have good reason to think that it's not just about even providing the particular mineral that a supplement company might be telling you you need. But when we get these in the context of, like Dr. Finch said, a very varied and whole foods rich diet, we're also contributing to things like the gut microbiome, which was always present for our ancestors because they
Oh,
did not live off processed foods and take broad spectrum antibiotics. They, generally speaking, carried their gut microbiome with them through life.
as do we, of course.
Can you tell us a little bit about whether there are steps that we can take if we're a middle aged American? We depend to some degree on the American diet, and we have some degree of a sedentary work environment. And there's fundamentally a difference between how we're living and how our ancestors were living. If we want to avoid or minimize some of the diseases of aging, if we want to extend our health span or improve our cognitive health for as long as possible, what are a couple of practical things that we can put into effect today that are research based, that are not going with the crazy next supplement or therapy? What are things
Well,
we can
it's
do to change our lives?
basically what's good for the heart is good for the brain and the body. So all the risk factors for heart attacks are shared with risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. And the possibility is that these are modern diseases that have to do with the reduction uh, of infections, the reduction of the amount of exercise we get, and for some people, the reduction of good food. So, one of the populations that I study with my anthropology colleagues is in Bolivia, the Tsimane, Tsimane, and they are their life expectancy uh, at birth 20 years ago was essentially 40 or 45, what meant that if they reached age 30, they had a 30-year life expectancy, so that a few people would, everybody would know a grandparent, but there would be very, very few people over 80. So the, the group of people that I work with, cardiologists and neuroscientists in the Bolivian study, we were and published papers that essentially there is almost no cardiovascular disease, uh, and and no advanced Alzheimer's in this population.
That
So,
is fascinating. That is absolutely fascinating.
well, it is. This follows up on a larger basis, many more uh, imaging studies, heart and brain, than had been done. The basic conclusion that heart disease is rare in indigenous people was noted 100 years ago, but now we actually have data on the amount of calcium in the blood vessels, in the aorta, and in the coronary arteries of the heart to show that the Tsimane are 20 years slower in their rate of accumulation of calcium. And uh, we also find that their rate of brain atrophy is 20 or 30% slower than North America, Europe.
And this
So,
is not, this can't be excused as there's simply no reporting of these diseases because these anthropological studies were actually conducted with modern medical imaging. So this is
and
not
this,
simply saying we don't know if they have this. This is saying we have done the studies, performed the imaging, and the calcium scores show significantly less
slower by 20
age-associated
years.
calcium accumulation and brain atrophy. This is fascinating.
Yeah, well, that's in major scientific journals in the last uh, 8 years. And it leads to the possibility that the modern epidemics of heart disease and Alzheimer's disease are really a 20th century phenomenon. And it was much, much less. Uh, I'm sure individual cases can be found going back into the ancient medical literature. I know this. So, but the epidemic scale of this seems to be a 20th century phenomenon.
There is so much that we would want to do with a pill, but if it is to the scale that we see it in the Western world, a factor of our lifestyle, do we find any hope in the sort of promises of products like the Senolytics research branch where people think they will perhaps take a pill and clear out all the old cells, or are we kind of going down the wrong path with that?
I think the senolytics uh, are not are a long way from being clinically shown, and it turns out that uh, senescent-like cells have an important role in development and regeneration. So the idea, and there's a number of people who've written on this, and I have an article published last year on this, that there's no basis for taking these drugs on a general scale that may impair normal regeneration, and we don't know what it'll do to the organs that had these senescent cells in them. So this is, I think, at this point, highly speculative. The people who are doing this research are very careful about it, but it's been, uh, I think, excited a lot of people outside of the rigorous scientists to think that this is another pill that will kind of help. And right now, that would be really premature to say.
I think it's worth pointing out that whether it's the senolytics or a lot of the other sort of therapeutic options that are trumpeted by marketers or companies or pharmaceuticals or various media outlets, many of these studies are not done in humans. Many of these trials, simply because of the ability to perform these experiments primarily in animal models, don't have time to be validated in human populations before they hit the market or before they're having their time, their 15 minutes of fame in the media. Why is that problematic?
Well, the point is that it's an extraordinarily expensive to do a clinical trial on people representing multi ethnic groups. Most of the, until 20 years ago, for example, uh, most of the drug trials were on white men of college education who were those who could afford to see their doctor. And including women in these trials uh, only really began in the last 20 or 30 years. So having a population meaningful clinical trial is extraordinarily expensive, $1 billion plus, to have the 10,000 people that need to be recruited from multiple ethnic uh, groups. So my expectation is that there will be continuing small clinical trials that will be very informative, but don't get us to the population level where the reality of aging is quite different than in people who can visit clinics.
So, making sure that we have representative population samples, and then, of course, making sure that we actually trial these therapies broadly enough and for long enough of a period. If we go with any kind of model that requires application of a senolytic from middle age to older age, we're talking about a trial that could potentially be decades long, and very few marketers and very few
No, it
pharmaceutical
simply
companies.
wouldn't happen.
Nobody wants to invest
No,
that
it
much
wouldn't
before
happen.
taking it to market.
No, the longest trials that I can think of are 5 to 10 years, and those are rare.
So, can we say, as a rule of thumb, if you are seeing an advertisement for some kind of a pill you can pop that's suggesting it will significantly increase your lifespan, that this is a poorly verified claim?
Yeah, not. I mean, you just be polite about it and say this is a exaggeration.
Don't get hoaxed, people.
Not
So,
everybody is hopeful.
what are you most excited to see in the coming years in the field of aging research?
Well, better understanding of how uh, genes and the environment interact. And one of those huge questions has to do with sex differences or gender differences. Uh, Women live an average of 3 to 5 years longer than men, but at later ages, there's a higher risk of dementia. So those are the Y chromosome has about 25 active genes on them. Some of them are responsible for the hairs on my chin, making testosterone. But we really are at the beginning of understanding uh, sex differences in gene regulation throughout the lifespan. And each sex or gender, if you put it in a societal sense, has different risk factors by decade. And that depends upon the history of the population, of course, uh, as well as the clinical accessibility to medicine and to care, uh, I expect that we'll understand a lot more about specific gene environment interactions, but I fear that this will be only useful for the minority of the health elite that can do something about it in modifying their lifestyle and with drugs. Um, so, my expectation is that uh, there may be slight increases in the healthy lifespan, but there will be no expectation that the maximum lifespan of 120 will be uh, achieved for more than uh, one person in 10 billion.
So the predictions of the futurists like Ray Kurzweil that we're rapidly approaching a sort of longevity runaway where we can all significantly reverse aging so quickly that we counter it faster than we accumulate it. Those are perhaps expressions of a hopeful future that
Those are
that we don't have.
fanciful uh, expectations.
The complexity of biology has not quite yet been cracked.
It, the more we look, the more complex cell interactions are. But anyway, it works well enough to get me to 85.
Dr. Finch, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate your excellent questions. See you soon.
Thank you.